The words sliced through the comfortable quiet of their living room, sharper than the chill of the autumn evening settling outside. Pack your things and be gone by morning. Julian didn't shout. He never did. His cruelty was a quieter, more suffocating kind, delivered with the same calm demeanor he used to discuss stock prices or the weather. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the picture of composed authority. For a moment, Clara couldn't connect the man she had loved, or thought she had loved, for 20 years with the stranger issuing this final, devastating decree. Her breath caught, a knot of ice forming in her chest. "What did you say?" she whispered, the sound barely audible over the crackling fire. "You heard me, Clara," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes, the same ones that had once looked at her with what she'd mistaken for adoration, were flat and cold. "It's over. I've been patient, but I can't do this anymore. This marriage is a weight I'm no longer willing to carry." Every word was a blow. She thought of the life they had built, or rather, the life she thought they had built together. The small roadside diner they had taken over when it was just a failing shack. The charming bed and breakfast next door that she had poured her soul into, transforming it from a derelict house into a sought-after retreat. Their life was here, on this plot of land, nestled in the rolling hills that had been her sanctuary. She looked around the room, at the worn armchair where she'd read countless stories, the faded rug that had absorbed the laughter and tears of 2 decades, the faint pencil marks on a doorframe measuring a height that was no longer there. It was all hers. His. Theirs. Wasn't it? "Julian, please," she started, the words stumbling out. "We can talk about this. We can work through it. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it." She felt a familiar, coiling shame at the pleading tone in her voice. It was a role she had played too often, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over his moods and absorbed his silent resentments. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "There's nothing to fix. I've met someone. She's simpler. She doesn't come with all this baggage." He gestured vaguely, a sweep of his hand that seemed to encompass not just Clara, but the entire life she had so carefully curated. The mention of another woman was a different kind of pain, a hot, searing betrayal that eclipsed the cold shock of his initial command. It was a confirmation of 1,000 tiny fears she had pushed aside, 1,000 late nights he had blamed on work, 1,000 moments of emotional distance she had excused as stress. Clara felt a strange stillness descend upon her. The initial panic began to recede, replaced by something else, something colder and harder. It was the quiet, resolute click of a door locking into place. She had begged for the last time. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man she barely recognized. A man puffed up with a sense of his own importance, so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't see the truth standing right in front of him. He saw her as an accessory to his life, a part of the scenery, an employee, almost. He had always handled the big finances, the bank meetings, the investment accounts, making her feel small and incapable. He had praised her for her little hobbies, the diner, the B&B, as if they were quaint pastimes, and not the very heart of their income. The engine that had paid for his expensive cars and tailored suits. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp. Her father, a farmer with hands like worn leather and a heart full of cautious wisdom, sitting with her at this very table not long before he passed away. "Never let a man be the sole owner of your peace of mind, or your roof," he had told her, his voice rough with love. He had seen the dynamic in her marriage long before she was willing to admit it to herself. His words and the inheritance he had left her, an inheritance Julian knew nothing about, had been her secret shield. An inheritance she had used 3 years ago, when the original owner of the land, a shrewd old man who had always liked her more than Julian, decided to sell. Julian had wanted to secure a massive bank loan to put them in debt for decades. He had scoffed when Clara suggested they use their savings. What he didn't know was that she had walked into that meeting alone the next day and bought it all outright. The land, the diner, the bed and breakfast, all of it. Her name, and hers alone, was on the deed, tucked away in a safe deposit box he had never once thought to look in. He was still talking, his voice a low drone of self-justification, explaining how generous he was being by giving her until morning. He would, of course, keep the businesses. He had the financial acumen to manage them, he explained, while she could have the car and a portion of their joint savings. Enough to get her started somewhere new. Clara stood up, her legs feeling surprisingly steady. The tears she thought would come were absent. In their place was a profound, almost unnerving calm. The woman who was afraid to displease her husband The woman who would have begged and sobbed an hour ago was gone. "No, Julian," she said, her voice even and clear. It carried a weight that made him pause. He frowned. "No? What do you mean, no? You don't have a choice." A slow smile touched Clara's lips. It didn't reach her eyes, which held the cool, steady light of a star that had long since died but continued to shine. "That's where you're wrong," she said softly. "I do have a choice. You, on the other hand—" She let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken truth a gathering storm. "You've made a terrible mistake." Julian stared at her, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. It was as if she had suddenly started speaking a language he didn't understand. The script he had written in his head, the one where she dissolved into a puddle of tears and begged for his forgiveness, had been abruptly discarded. "A mistake? Clara, don't be dramatic. I'm trying to handle this with dignity. The best thing for you to do is to accept it and move on." "Oh, I will be moving on," she replied, her voice still holding that unnerving quiet. She walked over to the small, ornate secretary desk in the corner of the room, a piece she had lovingly restored herself. Her fingers, steady and sure, retrieved a small silver key from a hidden drawer. "But you seem to be under a grave misapprehension about who will be leaving." She moved not with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, but with the deliberate grace of a queen retaking her throne. She crossed the room to the heavy oak cabinet where they kept important documents, or rather, where he kept the documents he deemed important. Julian watched her, a sneer beginning to form on his lips, as if he were indulging a child's last, desperate tantrum. "What are you doing now? Looking for some sentimental letter to remind me of the good times?" "It won't work." Clara didn't answer. She simply inserted the key into the lock of a lower drawer he rarely opened, one filled with what he called her household nonsense. She withdrew a single, crisp manila folder. It felt heavy in her hands, not with paper, but with the weight of her own liberation. She walked back to the fireplace and stood opposite him, the folder held loosely at her side. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating the lines of resolve that had replaced the soft uncertainty of before. For the first time, Julian felt a genuine prickle of unease. This was not the Clara he knew. The pliable, accommodating woman he had married was gone, and in her place stood a stranger with his wife's face. "You've always been so confident in your own brilliance, Julian," Clara began, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the menu for the diner. "So sure that you were the architect of this life. You handled the big picture, while I was left to potter around with my little projects." "They are little projects," he snapped, his composure starting to crack. "Charming, yes. Profitable in a small way. But without my financial guidance, they would have failed years ago." "Is that so?" she asked, one eyebrow arching delicately. "That's fascinating, because the numbers tell a very different story. While you were guiding our finances into a series of questionable investments that barely broke even, my little projects were paying our bills. They paid for this house. They paid for your car. They paid for the expensive trip to Italy you took last year, the one I was too busy to go on because I had to manage the summer rush at the B&B. She opened the folder. The first document she pulled out was a detailed summary of profits and losses for the past 5 years, prepared by her accountant. She had been meeting with him secretly for months. She laid it on the mantel, right next to Julian's hand. "You'll see here that the diner and the bed and breakfast account for nearly 90% of our total income. Your investments account for the rest, after losses." Julian's eyes darted to the paper, a flush rising from his neck. "That's a distortion. You're not looking at the market context." "Oh, but I am," Clara interrupted smoothly. She pulled out another set of papers. "These are the deeds, not copies, the originals." She let him see the top page, her name printed in clear, unambiguous type. Clara Annalise Rosewood. His name was nowhere to be found. 3 years ago, when Mr. Abernathy decided to sell this land, you were in a panic. You wanted to leverage everything, take on a mountain of debt that would have crushed us. You told me I didn't understand the complexity of the deal." She paused, letting the memory hang between them. "You were right. I didn't understand why you would choose debt when we had another option, so I took it." She placed the deeds on top of the financial summary. "I used the inheritance my father left me. The money you advised me to put into a fund that, by the way, has lost 7% of its value. I walked into Mr. Abernathy's office and I bought the land, the diner, and the house. All of it. In my name. Legally, irrevocably mine." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the logs in the fireplace. Julian's face had gone from a confident sneer to a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He stared at the documents, then back at Clara, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing, what she was saying. It was impossible. He was the one in control. He had always been the one in control. "You're lying," he finally breathed, the words laced with a desperation that was entirely new to him. "This is some kind of joke. A pathetic attempt to scare me." "Does it look like I'm joking?" Clara's voice was ice. "You told me to pack my things and be gone by morning. That seems like sound advice, Julian. I suggest you take it." She gestured toward the hallway. "You can pack a bag, take your car. I'll even give you that portion of our joint savings you were so generously offering me. It should be enough to get you started somewhere new." She was using his own words against him, turning the blade of his dismissal back on its wielder. The shock on his face was slowly curdling into a dark, impotent rage. He saw his future crumbling. The comfortable life, the assets he had boasted about to his new, simpler woman. It was all built on a foundation he didn't own. It was all hers. "You can't do this," he snarled, taking a step toward her. For a second, a flicker of the old fear returned to Clara, the instinct to shrink back, to appease. But it was gone as quickly as it came, burned away by the righteous fire of her newfound strength. "I can," she said, standing her ground. "I already have. The businesses are mine. The land is mine. This house is mine. You are a guest here, Julian, and your visit is over." Julian's face was a canvas of warring emotions. The disbelief was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes, but it was being rapidly painted over with the ugly, blotchy colors of pure fury. He was a man accustomed to having the final word, to being the one who held all the cards. To have the entire deck turned against him by the person he considered his most loyal, most docile subject was a violation of the natural order of his world. "You scheming bitch," he hissed, the words low and venomous. He took another step, his body tense, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You think you can just steal my life from under me? I'll fight you. I'll drag you through every court in this state. I'll take you for everything you have." Clara didn't flinch. The woman who would have once trembled at his anger now looked at him with something bordering on pity. "Your life?" she repeated, her voice deceptively soft. "Was it your life when you were spending the profits from my diner on another woman? Was it your life when you were lying to my face day after day? You have no life here, Julian, because you didn't build one. You were just a tenant, and your lease has expired." She watched him, her gaze unwavering. "And please do take me to court. I have a very good lawyer, the same one who handled the purchase of this property. The same one who advised me on how to keep my assets separate from our joint marital finances, just in case. My father didn't just leave me money, Julian. He left me with good advice, and I finally learned how to take it." Every word she spoke was a brick being laid in the wall between them, a wall he had no way to climb. The mention of a lawyer, of premeditation, sent a visible jolt through him. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion. It was a carefully executed strategy. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outplayed, and the realization seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. His rage began to deflate, replaced by a desperate, sputtering panic. He tried a different tactic, the one that had always worked before. He softened his expression, letting his shoulders slump, trying to project a wounded vulnerability. "Clara, listen to yourself," he said, his voice taking on a pleading, sorrowful tone. "This isn't you. This is anger talking. Think about us. Think about the 20 years we've shared. Are you really going to throw all of that away? For what? A moment of pride?" It was a masterful performance. For a fleeting second, she felt the old pull, the conditioned instinct to soothe his hurt feelings, to restore the peace at any cost. She saw the ghost of the man she had married, the charming, ambitious man who had promised her the world. But then she saw him for what he was now, a performer playing a role, trying to manipulate his audience of one. "The 20 years I remember," she said, her voice hardening again, "were filled with me working 16-hour days to make our businesses succeed while you criticized the font on the menus. The 20 years I remember involved me managing staff, juggling suppliers, and calming angry customers while you were off on business lunches that somehow never generated any business. And the 20 years I remember are over. You ended them. You just miscalculated the consequences." She pointed toward the door again. "Pack your things, Julian. I won't say it again." He stared at her, and in his eyes, she saw the final bitter truth land. He was beaten. The bravado, the anger, the feigned remorse, it all fell away, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a man who had staked everything on a bluff and lost. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the living room and up the stairs. Clara sank into her armchair, the one he had stood so arrogantly beside just a short time ago. The strength that had flooded her veins now ebbed, leaving a profound and aching weariness in its place. She listened to the sounds from upstairs, the opening and closing of drawers, the rustle of clothes being thrown into a suitcase. Each sound was a snip of the thread that had bound their lives together. There was no triumph in it, not really. There was a deep, gut-wrenching sadness for the love she had once believed in, for the future she had imagined. But beneath the sadness was a foundation of something new and solid. Relief. It was the relief of a back that has finally been unburdened, of a breath that can finally be drawn without fear. An hour later, he came back down the stairs, carrying a single suitcase and a briefcase. He looked smaller, diminished. He avoided her eyes, his face a tight mask of humiliation. He walked to the front door and paused, his hand on the knob. "You'll regret this, Clara," he said, his voice thick. Clara stood and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. She thought of all the things she could say. She could have screamed, she could have cried, she could have listed every single one of his betrayals. But she didn't. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, her heart steady. "No, Julian," she replied, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I won't." He flinched as if she had struck him. Without another word, he opened the door, stepped out into the cold night, and closed it behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden, absolute silence of the house. Clara stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of his car starting, the crunch of gravel as he drove away. And then, nothing. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of her own life, waiting for her to begin. She walked back into the living room, her living room, and looked at the deeds still sitting on the mantel. They were more than just paper. They were a declaration of independence. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely, utterly free. The sun rose the next morning, not with a sudden, jarring brightness, but as a slow, gentle tide of light washing across the bedroom floor. Clara was already awake. She hadn't slept the deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion, but had drifted in a light, peaceful slumber, the kind she hadn't experienced in years, untroubled by the need to listen for a key in the lock or the heavy sigh of a discontented husband. The other side of the bed was a cool, undisturbed expanse of white linen. The house was utterly still, but the silence felt different now. It was not the tense, watchful quiet that had so often preceded one of Julian's moods, but a vast, calming presence. It was the sound of peace. She got up and walked to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She looked out over the land that was so unequivocally hers. The rolling hills were bathed in the soft, forgiving gold of dawn. The roof of the diner was visible through the trees, a plume of steam already rising from its kitchen vent. And next door, the windows of the bed and breakfast were beginning to glow as the early rising guests stirred. For 20 years, she had looked out at this same view and felt a sense of shared pride, always tinged with a subtle, gnawing anxiety about Julian's approval or his next critique. This morning, for the first time, the feeling was pure and undiluted. It was a profound, grounding sense of ownership, a feeling of coming home to herself. She dressed not in the muted, conservative outfits Julian had always called elegant, but in a pair of comfortable, worn-in jeans and a brightly colored cashmere sweater he had once called garish. It felt like putting on a second skin, one that fit perfectly. When she walked into the diner an hour later, the familiar morning bustle enveloped her like a warm hug. The rich aroma of brewing coffee, the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, and the low hum of conversation from the regulars already settled in their booths. Her head waitress, Carol, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and eyes that missed nothing, looked up from pouring coffee. Her gaze scanned Clara's face, then flickered around the diner as if instinctively looking for a storm cloud on the horizon. "Just you this morning, Clara?" Carol asked, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes held the question. Clara smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. "Just me from now on, Carol." She didn't need to say more. A quiet, unspoken wave of understanding passed through the small, tight-knit crew. There were no gasps, no dramatic whispers. Gus, the burly cook who had been with her for 15 years, looked over from his post at the griddle, wiped a hand on his apron, and gave her a short, emphatic nod of solidarity. Carol's shoulders, usually held in a state of perpetual tension from Julian's habit of striding in and finding fault with everything from the sugar dispensers to the staff's aprons, visibly relaxed. She simply picked up a fresh pot of coffee. "Well, coffee's fresh," she said, her tone softening. "And Gus is trying a new cinnamon swirl pancake this morning. You should try it. On the house. An elderly farmer named Mr. Henderson, who had been eating breakfast at the same corner booth every morning for longer than she'd owned the place, caught her eye as she passed. He tipped his worn cap. "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good day for it." It was a simple phrase, but in his eyes, she saw a deep and knowing respect. They all knew. They had seen it all, her tireless work, and Julian's lazy, supervisory arrogance. Her quiet announcement wasn't a piece of shocking gossip. It was the confirmation of a long-awaited liberation, and they were her silent, steadfast allies. In that moment, Clara knew she wasn't just the owner of a business. She was the heart of a community. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush had subsided, she sat in the small office behind the kitchen. It was cluttered and chaotic, a space Julian had always disdained, but it was her command center. With a deep breath, she logged into the online banking portal, something Julian had always handled. She clicked through to the business accounts, and the numbers bloomed on the screen, solid and reassuringly black. The diner's account? Healthy. The B&B's account? Even healthier. It was all there, the tangible proof of her success, earned through her own sweat, creativity, and perseverance. There was no complex portfolio of risky stocks, just the steady, reliable income from two businesses that people loved. She printed the statements, the crisp hum of the machine, a quiet song of vindication. She walked over to the bed and breakfast. The scent of lavender and lemon polish, her own signature blend, greeted her at the door. One of the guests, a young woman staying for the week, approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "The handle on the wardrobe in the rose room is a bit loose. I'm afraid it might come off." Clara felt a ghost of a memory. Julian, faced with a similar minor issue, sighing dramatically and launching into a lecture about the shoddy quality of antiques, making the guest feel as if they had broken it. Clara smiled warmly at the young woman. "Thank you so much for letting me know. Don't you worry about it for a second. I've got just the thing for that." She went to her workshop in the back, retrieved a small screwdriver and a bit of wood glue, and fixed the handle in less than 5 minutes, chatting with the guest about her travel plans as she worked. It was simple, efficient, and human. It was her way. That evening, as twilight settled, she sat on the wide front porch of the B&B, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The lights of the diner glowed warmly through the trees, a beacon of comfort and constancy. She thought of Julian, not with the searing anger of last night, but with a distant, clinical detachment. He was a chapter of her life that was now closed, a difficult, painful chapter to be sure, but one that had, in its own brutal way, led her here, to this moment of quiet strength. She had not thrown away 20 years, she had invested them, and the return was this priceless, expansive freedom. Her father's words echoed in her mind, not as a warning, but as a promise fulfilled. She owned her roof, and more importantly, she owned her peace of mind. The future stretched out before her, no longer a narrow, treacherous path she had to navigate around someone else's ego, but an open field of possibilities. She could finally start those weekend gardening workshops she had always dreamed of, teaching others how to cultivate beauty from the earth. She could finally sit down and write the cookbook, a collection of the diner's most beloved recipes, a legacy of comfort food and community. She might even take a real vacation, a long one, to a place with a warm ocean, and entrust the businesses to Carol and her capable team, knowing they would thrive. She leaned her head back against the porch swing's chain, looking up at the first stars pricking the deep indigo sky. She had not only reclaimed her land and her businesses, she had reclaimed herself, her tastes, her decisions, her very breath. And that was a foundation no one could ever take from her again. The story of Clara is a powerful reminder that the deepest strength is often forged in the quiet moments we finally choose to honor our own truth. It's about realizing that you have always been the true architect of your own life, even when someone else was trying to hold the blueprints. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of hope and the courage to claim their own ground.